Welcome to CertiKit's webinar on the new standard 27001 2022. I'll just go through some housekeeping and some background information, and then we can dive into the actual webinar itself with our two hosts, Ken Holmes and Jerry Lawrence. Okay, so we're CertiKit, a leading creator of compliance toolkits, provide ISO services, and we're based in Derbyshire in the UK, a very foggy Derbyshire at the moment. Been around since about 2011. We've helped over 4,000 customers around the world achieve compliance to different standards. Well, we specialize in ISO standards and data protection like Cyber Essentials and GDPR. Our mission is to make compliance easy so that you and organizations like you can achieve certification and benefit from those chosen standards. And our ISO consultancy and internal auditing services are available remotely, and we do this through MS Teams to companies across the UK and EU and sometimes further afield. And if you want to find out more about us, please visit us at our website at certikit.com. So what we're going to cover today, well, what Ken and Jerry are going to cover today, we're going to talk about the background of the new version, the 27001, any wording changes or the wording changes within the standard, heading changes, the new Annex A control set, what happens now, then we're going to have a short discussion and time for questions on completion. And just a reminder for everybody who just joined us, we are recording this webinar throughout. So Ken Holmes is our Managing Director. He's a consultant specialising in information security and privacy with over 30 years of IT experience in a wide variety of industries. He is the father of the CertiKit range of ISO tools. He set up the first one, 27001. He is a certified 27001 lead auditor. He's also CISSP and CIPP privacy practitioner, an AWS certified cloud practitioner. He's responsible for running the 27001 certified ISMSM within our company. That's Ken, our boss. And he's joined by, hopefully the next slide, Jerry, young Jerry. He's one of the compliance consultants like myself. He's a qualified 27001 lead auditor. He has over 25 years experience holding various positions within governance, risk and compliance. Recently, he's covered both QA and information security management with a highly secure defense engineering company before moving across to us. And he provides 27001 consultancy and auditing services to CertiKit clients, mainly within the UK and the EU, although we have gone further afield. And I'll hand that across to Ken.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Ted. Okay, so what I wanted to do first was to give some background to the new version of ISO 27001 that came out towards the end of October. Highly anticipated, I would say. There's been a lot of buzz in the industry around what this is going to look like, and we'll get into sort of the journey up until when it was actually published, hopefully during this webinar as well. So what I wanted to do initially was just give you some background about where the standard has come from, really, and why we needed a new version of ISO 27001. So, I mean, the first thing to say is it's been 9 years since the last update. So the background for those that don't know with 27001 was that back in the day it was BS 7799, which is the British standard, then became internationalized as 27001 in 2005, which was the first version of that. Excuse me just a second. Sorry, I'm just admitting people from the lobby as well at the same time. Excuse me, we're doing that. Okay, so then it was refreshed in 2013, which is the version that's just been replaced. But certainly, as you probably know, ISO standards in general, you're looking at ideally 5 to 7 years for a refresh. They start looking at whether the standard needs to be changed around the sort of the 5-year mark. And then the idea really is that a new version of the standard would come out around the sort of 7-year point. So it's a little bit late, to be honest. I mean, sort of 9 years, that's quite a long time, particularly given the subject subject matter of the standard, obviously information technology and information security, moves on quite quickly. So some would perhaps say that 9 years is quite a long time. The other real reasons for having a new version of the standard was that you may also be familiar with the concept of what's generally known as Annex SL, or the harmonized structure, or the high-level structure, which has a number of different names. But basically what that is a standard layout effectively for management system standards. So we're talking about things like 9001, 14,000, and so on. So the idea is that they all have a management system, and that the wording of the management system in terms of the clauses and more detail than that, we'll see slightly further on, that the actual wording of the text should be as common as possible. This is really about organizations being able to implement multiple ISO management systems. So you can have an integrated management system, say running 9001 and 14,001, or 9001 and 27,001, as we do within CertiKit. So the structure has developed. In 2013, when the last version of 27,001 came out, it was one of the first standards to adopt the new Annex SL structure, but they further developed this harmonized structure over the last 9 years. So part of the reason for producing this new version of the standard is to introduce this changed text, so that the degree of commonality with some of the other standards is as much as possible. The other big thing, as I'm sure you all have heard, is that there was a new version of 27002, the guidance document that came out in February this year. So this is where the Annex A controls come from at the back of the 27001 standard. So the fact that a new version of 27002 came out in February, it was pretty much a certain thing that there was going to have to be a new version 27001, because we don't really want the two things, 27001 and 27002, to be out of step, really. 27002 is a very good document. It's quite a long document, and we'll come on to it later. But if you want more information about the detail of the controls in Annex A of 27001, that's basically where you find it. There's also quite a lot of good stuff about the mapping of the controls from the old version of the standard to the new version. So plenty of good stuff in 27002, well worth a look there. And the other real sort of pillar, I guess we'd call it, of why ISO wanted to update the 27001 standard was because there's an increasing need for organizations, particularly larger organizations, to comply with multiple frameworks. So 27001 doesn't stand in isolation. There are other frameworks that are used throughout the world, and there's also various other regulatory requirements, things like Sarbanes-Oxley and things like PCI DSS. There's various other frameworks to do with NIST, for example. So there's quite a lot of choice, really, in terms of if you're looking for an approach for information security, then which of these control sets and which of these approaches should you take. So part of what they're trying to do with 27001 this time is to introduce an element of flexibility, really, with it, so that organizations need to comply with multiple frameworks, as I say, for regulatory and legal reasons, largely, find it easier to do. So there's a lot of background here with this new version of the standard to make things easier for organizations to cope with the modern world effectively in the way that it now works. Okay, so let's have a look at the actual changes that have taken place. Now, some of these, in fact, a lot of these, I will say first off, are fairly dry. I mean, the actual changes to the management system, some of them are pretty innocuous. There's a few that we'll look at that maybe involve a little bit more work for those organizations that are either approaching certification or have been certified for a while. But we'll go through these. But don't expect too much in terms of excitement of some of these. Some of them are fairly small changes. So the first one is in clause 4.2. Understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. So basically what they've done is they've added that there's a bulleted list in there saying the organization shall determine the interested parties and be their requirements. They've added a point C, which basically says which of these requirements will be addressed through the information security management system. So basically the change here is that when you're defining your interested parties and the requirements of those interested parties, as well as defining the requirements, you also need to say, well, which of them are actually relevant to going to be addressed through the ISMS. So there may be some that aren't particularly relevant to information security. They're still requirements of interested parties, but it's really adding a little bit more detail in terms of what the ISMS is actually intended to achieve. We then have a change in 4.4, clause 4.4, information security management system, where basically the change here is that it's introduced some wording that requires you to look at the processes needed and their interactions within your ISMS. And we'll come on to this a little bit in some of the other changes as well. There's quite a lot of emphasis on process here. So in order to meet this, really, you need to look at the processes that you have within your ISMS, how they interact. And later on, we'll see you're also looking at establishing the criteria for those processes. So there's a bit more process design and attention required within this. Again, this is really just introducing the Annex SL wording, so it's common across most of the others, well, ideally all of the other standards that we're talking about. So there's that change there. Other changes, 5.3, just bear with me a second. Okay, so within 5.3, organizational roles, responsibilities and authorities, what they've done here is they've added the phrase within the organization at the end of a sentence within this particular part. So if I can just tell you basically what it says, basically, it says top management shall ensure that the responsibilities and authorities for roles relevant to information security are assigned and communicated. It used to be a full stop there in the previous version. What they've done is they've expanded that and they've said within the organization. To me, that's a fairly obvious change. I mean, I guess you're going to be assigning roles and responsibilities. You're probably going to do them within the organization anyway. So that's more really of a clarification. And you'll see some of these changes are changes that you're probably doing already if you have an ISMS. So some of them aren't necessarily going to involve a lot of work. It's probably the process areas that probably have a bit more attention, really. So within clause 6.1.3, in terms of information security risk treatment, what we then have is the notes have been replaced. So there were various notes, including references to Annex A, and the wording of some of these notes has been changed in order to some extent de-emphasize the need to necessarily do the controls in Annex A. As I said earlier, there is a bit more choice with this. So it is possible that you could use alternative sets of controls as well as Annex A. You could, if you wanted to, use the previous versions of the Annex A controls as well. There's a bit more flexibility there. As long as you can justify it, then that should be fine. So the notes are replaced in that section in order to emphasize that. A second. Okay, and then within 6.2, basically what we have here is that they've added the phrase that there is a need to monitor objectives. So there's a list within the standard when it's dealing with the definition of objectives for your ISMS. There's a list in terms of what these objectives should be. So there's things like they should be consistent, they should be measurable, and they've basically revamped that list, and they've added to it the fact that the objectives should be monitored. Again, to me, that's something that I think most people that have objectives are going to monitor them anyway. So you're probably already doing that particular thing. Okay, so that was 6.2. Let me just talk about some additional wording changes. So 7.4, I'm just letting people into the webinar here. So in terms of 7.4 communication, again, it's a fairly innocuous change. I don't know if you remember in the previous version of the standard, there was information about how you should do your communication and so on. There's a bit more detail in the previous version. They've really replaced some of that detail. They've just said you need to determine how to communicate. So again, that's really, I'll put that in the box of a simplification of the standard. Again, you're probably going to be doing that already because the previous version of the standard required you still to do that, but in slightly different wording. Now, in terms of 8.1, clause 8.1, we get into a little bit more sort of interest there. So in terms of 8.1, what's been added here is the need to establish criteria for the processes of the ISMS. So I mentioned this earlier that there's much more emphasis on processes within your ISMS and defining what the processes of the ISMS are. And this part of 8.1 is really introducing the idea that you need to define what those processes should achieve. So the criteria involved in that. A lot of this is about risk, but it's also about exactly what the inputs and outputs of these processes should be. And there's more emphasis on a process approach to the management system. There is also a new clause, which is 6.3, which is about planning of changes. So this introduces the requirement that if any changes are identified to the management system, to the ISMS, then the implementation of those changes needs to be planned. So really what we're talking about here is a simple planning process, recognizing the fact that there have been some changes to the ISMS and effectively defining what those changes are, what your approach is to implementing those changes, who's going to do what, when they're going to do it, and what the outputs are going to be. So a basic planning process. The requirement doesn't necessarily require any more than that. Obviously, you're going to want to sort of scale up and down your planning process depending upon the size of the changes required. So at the lower end, if they're relatively minor changes, an auditor would expect to see a fairly light touch of planning. But if you're having a significant revamp of your ISMS, then the auditor would then expect to see more evidence of more detailed planning having taken place in the implementation of that. Okay. So those were the actual wording changes. So those are the changes to the text of the standard. And as I mentioned before, it's mainly around processes. A lot of the changes there are fairly innocuous, and I don't think too many people are going to have too many problems with introducing changes to cope with those. There have also been some heading changes. So this is where the formatting really sort of comes in. So within 9.2 internal audit, they've split this up. It used to be all the text was under 9.2. They've split it so there's now a 9.2.1 general and a 9.2.2 internal audit program. So there's a split between that. They split it into two. No new requirements in there. It's really just heading changes. And similarly with 9.3 management review, used to be the case as well with the 2013 version. It was just a simple 9.3 heading, and then there was the text. They split that up into three. So they've had a general sub clause, and then they split the rest of it into inputs and results. So again, no real new requirements here. So if you're conforming with the previous requirements of the standard, then you're not going to struggle too much with these. And in terms of clause 10 improvement, what they've done with this really is just move it around. So there was 10.1 and 10.2 previously, they've swapped them over. So basically, I don't know what happened here as to whether they've changed the definition of the way this should work, or whether a mistake was made in the early version of 27001. I'm not sure which one it is, but basically they've decided that continual improvement comes before non-conformity and corrective action. So they've taken steps to move those around. So again, just basically formatting changes there. Okay, so let's talk about the Annex A control set. So you remember that in the 2013 version of the standard, we basically had 14 categories of Annex A controls, a total of 114 controls. What's happened here really is that they've consolidated them. There are now a total of 93 controls split into 4 themes. So the word that's being used is themes rather than categories. They're fairly uneven. So in organizational controls, we've got 37 controls. Technological, again, we've got 34, and then we've got the two smaller brothers, if you like, of the themes, people and physical, with 8 and 14 controls respectively. So what they've done is there's a process really of taking some of those 114 controls that are in the 2013 version, merging some of them, get them together, and trying to make it a bit more consistent. They've also introduced in 27002, which is another reason why 27002 is a good thing to look at, the idea of sort of attributes. So the idea here is that you can then look at these controls and you can cut and dice them effectively in several different ways. And this goes back to the idea I was talking about previously, where you may need to comply with multiple frameworks. So there are various ways in there you can use attributes to show how the controls in Annex A map onto things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, this kind of thing. Okay, so they've changed those. There are some new Annex A controls, so it seems a bit strange, having gone down from 114 to 93, that there are 11 new ones as well. I guess this really shows the degree of consolidation that they've done with some of the controls. As I mentioned before, if you want to find out how the old control set maps onto the new control set, that information is in ISO 27002. The appendices there show you how the new maps to the old and the old maps to the new. So if you really want to sort of find that out, then that's where to look. And again, another reason for looking at that. So in terms of the new Annex A controls, there's a few good ones in here. I mean, there's some that you'd kind of question whether they really are new. I mean, things like web filtering, for example. I'm sure we've all been doing web filtering for decades, so I'm not sure you'd technically call that a new control. There are some areas here where I think we're moving more in the direction of cloud. So A523, information security for the use of cloud services. There's a bit more information and a bit more requirements in there in Annex A to do with use of cloud services, obviously with the fact that cloud marches on. And there's also a sort of a nod really to the privacy side of things with things like 8.10 information deletion. So there's a requirement there, or a control there, to look at your policy for deleting particularly PII, personal identifiable information. And there's also 8.11 is to do with data masking. So things like anonymization of personal identifiable information and so on. So some of these controls are new to the whole thing. Threat intelligence, if I can pick that one out as well. I don't remember there being a reference to threat intelligence in the previous control set, and that's certainly a good thing to have. So some of these are good things. Some of them I would characterize more as a slight shifting round of the control set that was in there previously. So of these 11 new ones, some are more new than others, I would say. Okay, so we've basically gone through what's changed in the management system and what's changed in the Annex A control. So in terms of what happens now with the fact that we have this new version of 27001, so the standard was published in October this year. Kind of expected at the end of October, popped up slightly early, about a week or so early, really, based on the estimates that we were given. There is a 3-year transition period, so if you're already certified to the 2013 version of the standard, you've got 3 years effectively to get to the 2022 version. Certification to the new version of the standard, what we're being told at the moment by BSI mainly is that it will be available around Feb to April 2023. So even though the standards have been published by ISO, certainly in the UK with BSI, you can't become certified to 2022 version yet. You've got to wait until the certification bodies are ready to offer certification to the standard. And what we're being told is that's probably first quarter next year. So the 3-year transition period means that as of October 2025, you can no longer be certified to the 2013 version of 27001. If you started down the road of certification and you still want to become certified to the 2013 version because you put a lot of work into that and so on, then the date you need to remember there is April 2024. So there's an 18-month time period where you can still become certified as a new organization to the current or the previous version of the standard. But beyond April 2024, if you want to become certified, it's going to have to be to the 2022 version. So these are fairly typical timescales. We saw similar things happen with the new version of 9001, 20,000. You know, it is a fairly standard things to say, really. But a lot of thinking really depends on where you are in your implementation of your ISMS, whether you're already certified, and how much work is involved in moving to the new version of the standard, if that's the thing that you decide you need to do. Okay, so that's basically the introduction to what's going on with the new version of ISO 27001. Just to mention a little bit about CertiKit. So, I mean, Ted mentioned a few of these things before. So we're in the business of writing toolkits to help people to implement standards like ISO 27001 as quickly and easily as possible. And we offer a variety of services around that as well to help you use our toolkits to speed up the process of certification. So we offer consultancy in implementation, and we also offer ongoing ISO internal auditing services as well, if that's something that you would find useful. Okay, so with that, then I'm going to hand back to Ted and for our discussion.
Okay, before we go into the discussion points, if anybody in the audience has any questions, if you just drop them into the chat box, and we'll pick them up after this session for Q&A. So I've got a number of discussion points to open up to both Ken and Jerry and get their opinions from them. So starting with, from an overall point of view, is this a good update? Ken.
Okay, so I'd say this one first then. I mean, I mentioned a couple of things there which are kind of new, but not new at the same time. Overall, I think the answer is yes. I think it's good that we've waited 9 years really for an update to 27001. It's a difficult one because you look at 27001, you kind of think, well, it's a technical standard, but it isn't really. It's a process standard, and so you could make the argument that that really, because it's a process standard, the process itself doesn't change that much. And also, as we saw during what I was saying before, the point about this is that the process is the same process, same management system process, really, as standards like quality and environmental and business continuity and so on. So, you know, from that point of view, you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be updated that often. But I think it's good that there is an update, because I think there is an expectation that there would be that. I think it's good to make it more similar to some of the ISO management systems. Certainly, as a company, what we're seeing is more clients wanting to run an integrated management system. So they want to run sort of 9 and 27, etc., or sort of 914 or 27 and 22301 business continuity, for example. So anything that they do to make that an easier process, I think, has got to be a good thing. So from the management system point of view, I think that's good that they've made it more harmonized, if you like. From the point of view of the Annex A controls, I think it's good that there's less controls or fewer controls. The themes, we'll have to see how that goes in terms of using these sort of attributes to categorize your themes. When I first saw that in an early draft of 27002, I'm not sure whether that's going to take off or not. Depends how people use it, and it will be interesting to see whether people do make some use of that. Obviously, that's part of 27002, so it's not required in 27001. But we'll see how that goes. So, on the whole, I would say yes. In terms of what people sort of expected would be in there, I'm not sure whether people might have expected a bit more sort of techie stuff in there, but you know, given the fact that 9 years is a long time in information technology. But to be honest, I thought that with the last one. So from 2005 to 2013, again, was 8 years with the previous versions. A bit surprised that time, but on the whole, I would say my answer would be yes, it is a good update.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Jerry, has anything surprised you about this new version?
Well, I was perhaps a tad underwhelmed, but then again, you got to bear in mind that it is one of the only probably governance frameworks that there is in terms of a management system. So I suppose it was good. I think the timing was definitely a good thing to do. You know, people start to question, if you like, the relevancy of a standard if it gets too old in terms of its date. And like Ken said, 2013 was the last iteration. I think a lot of people were beginning to see that technology moves on, and the harmonization of the other standards certainly makes life easier with the integrated management system side. So I think from my perspective, yeah, I think that it is a good update, I suppose. And like I say, I was a little bit surprised that they've actually removed certain control, but I think they haven't technically removed them from what I can understand. I think a lot of things are more hard, if you like, merging. And I think the expectation of the standard is going to be the same in the long run. I don't think they've actually shot themselves in the foot in that respect. So I think that's really my input on it.
If I could just sort of mention a couple of things that surprised me a little bit about it. I suppose the main one was probably the process of actually getting to where we are now with a published standard. I'd not really seen this before. I mean, typically what happens with these standards is that they come out with a draft. Well, they decide whether or not it needs changing. If they decide it does need changing, then they come out with a draft, and then there's a final draft. There's a bit of voting goes on, and then they publish the standard. What happened with this was surprising to me, because
they changed their mind, didn't they?
Well, at first it came out as going to be an amendment. So a draft amendment was published, which basically just made some fairly small changes to the management system and said we'll use the new version of Annex A. I think possibly, and looking at it, as I did a bit of research at the time, and certainly looking at the way ISO works as an organization and their processes, that did seem to actually be the correct administrative path that the change should have gone. But I think it was going to confuse the heck out of everybody, including me, I must admit, because you would have had to become certified to the current version of the standard plus the amendment, and it all got a bit complicated fairly quickly. So at some stage they went down the process of calling it an amendment, and then they changed their minds, and all of a sudden it wasn't an amendment, it was going to be a new version of the standard, which was a bit of a surprise. Not only that, but also I don't know whether because they did that there wasn't a draft published, a publicly available draft that you could buy on the website. So there was a bit of a case of trying to work out, what was going to come out from various sources and so on. But as I say, normally they publish the final draft. You can buy it on the website, have a good look at it, and then you know pretty much what's going to happen. So the route to where we are now was surprising. The other thing, without beating ISO up too much, is that I mentioned before there's a clause 6.3 that's been added to the management system. So I went and I bought a copy of the standard as soon as it came out, and this is actually still the case if you look on the ISO website at the moment. 6.3 isn't in the table of contents. They've obviously missed it out. So it seems as if they've added the text in there, so there is a 6.3 within the standard, but when they obviously forgot to refresh the table of contents, so it goes 6.1, 6.2, and there's no 6.3. It's not a big thing when you consider sort of what ISO does, and it's about standards and so on. It's a surprising omission. I have reported this to ISO, and I got a very nice email back saying thank you for pointing it out. But looking at the website at the moment, they still haven't changed it. So there was a couple of things where I felt this release was a little bit rough around the edges in terms of the way it was approached and the way it was implemented. But that's just a personal opinion.
Yeah, I think they did the right thing though by eventually, aligning the 2022, Annex. The 27001 2022 to the fact that they've done a 27002 2022. It's a lot less confusing. They've got the two matching
absolutely
documents now, and I think that will certainly avoid a lot of the confusion that was going to be around that original sort of amendment.
Okay, so this one at you two. What should an organisation that is partway through ISMS implementation do now?
All right. Yeah, I mean, I've got a few clients and I'm working with at the moment. My advice to them is if you're close to certification, you're well on the road, and by close to certification, I mean sort of within the next 2 to 3 months, sort of that time frame. My advice is just basically go for the 2013 certification, get that one finished, get that out of the way, and then just go into a transition. If you're beyond that sort of 3 months time frame, sort of in the next 3 to 6 months or so, it's up to you. It depends, I suppose, how desperate you are to get certified and how eager you want to get that certificate, in which case you can basically decide, I think, to do one or the other, or either hold off or do as you would normally do, get certified and worry about transition at a later stage. anything beyond that sort of 6 to 9 month time frame, I would probably pretty much just go straight for the 2022, because by then I think Ken mentioned that the cert bodies themselves should be in a position to offer certification to the new standard sometime, hopefully probably Q1 time frame. So once they're in a position to offer that, and I would just go for it. Go for it on that basis later on in the year.
Okay. Anything from you, Ken?
Yeah, I'd agree with that generally. I mean, as an organisation, we're certified to 27001 2013, and we've just had our surveillance audit with BSI for that, and so we kind of discussed it with the auditor, and from our point of view, as a certified organisation, we've been certified for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years or so now. There's no particular hurry for us to. We're not going to rush into doing it particularly. It depends on your perception of whether a certification to the 2022 version of the standard is more valuable or is seen in the marketplace, or for whatever reasons you're becoming certified or are certified, whether you think that holds more weight than the 2013 version. But as we've seen, the changes to the management system are fairly small. And the Annex A controls, basically what they're saying is that all of the controls that are in the previous version are in the new version as well. And they've added those 11 additional controls, but a lot of those additional controls are things that I think most organizations would have been doing anyway. They just weren't separately specified as Annex A controls. I mean, say things like web filtering and so on. So I think it partly depends on how much benefit you think you're going to get from moving to the new version of the standard sooner rather than later. I mean, 3 years is a long time. You know, I mean, there's plenty of time to do that. I guess those would be my comments.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing just to mention as well, that just because those extra controls have been added into the standard doesn't necessarily mean they apply, because what I would definitely do is go back to your risk assessment again, do your risk assessment, and depending on what the resultant output of the risk assessment is, some of those controls might still be unapplicable to you. So just because they're there doesn't mean they have to be used.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, what do you think will happen with other standards that map onto the Annex A controls, such as 2717 and 2715? Will they have an impact on the statement of applicability?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, this, because just as there was a time lag, if you like, between 27002 and then the updates 27001. I don't know if everybody is familiar with some of the other standards that kind of map onto. Well, really, they map onto 27002, but you could almost, certification-wise, they really sort of map onto 27001. So some of the most popular ones are 27701, which is privacy. So it's to do with GDPR and so on, implementing a privacy management framework and so on. And the way that standard works, you can become certified to 27701 in addition to 27001. You have to have 27001 first to be able to become certified to that. But the way it works is it basically takes the Annex A controls and it says, okay, let's add some bits into some of the existing Annex A controls, and we'll add a few more additional controls in there as well to cover off privacy. So what an organization can then do is they can become certified to 27001 and then also become certified to 27701. But the point about this is that it maps onto the Annex A controls, and the Annex A controls have now changed. So the current version of 27701 maps onto the old, if I can call it old, the old 114 controls of Annex A, which gives an organization that's certified to both those standards a bit of a problem at the moment. It's not an insurmountable problem, it's just more of a twist, really. I did look on the ISO website the other day, and I can see that ISO has started the process of refreshing two of the standards that we mentioned, so 27701 and also 27017, which is to do with cloud controls and so on. So they have started the process of producing a draft, which is going to then map onto the new control set. How long that will take, the wheels tend to move fairly slowly. if I'd stick my neck out, I'd say we're probably looking at another year or so really before that's going to be out. So we're going to have a period of time where these standards don't map onto the latest version of Annex A. So it's not really a problem if you're not involved in those standards. I mean, the other thing I would say is that it's like bugbear of mine really, which is things like 27017, which is to do with cloud security. Really, that's a code of practice. It's quite wordy. It looks at cloud computing from a customer point of view and from a cloud service provider point of view. It's quite a long document. It's got more akin with 27002 than with 27001, and there's been an interesting trend over the last few years of organizations becoming certified to documents which were never really intended to be certifiable. I think AWS was one of the first ones to do this, where they took 27017 and said, yep, we'll become certified to that. The other one I'd mentioned is 27018, which is about the protection of PII in the cloud. So they don't really lend themselves to being auditable standards, in my opinion. But that doesn't seem to stop anybody offering, the certification bodies offering certification to them. But again, a similar thing with 27017, in that the draft has started, so that if you're thinking about doing that, I would probably wait until the new version of 27017 comes out, which still may be some time. No sign of a new version of 27018, however, so I don't know whether they're going to refresh that or not, or whether there'll be some sort of consolidation in the 27000 family. Only time will tell.
Yeah,
That's
one
me.
of the most probably the most unpublicized thing. I only learned this through a very experienced auditor, that even on the old version of the standard, you didn't have to use the Annex A. You could actually totally substitute using you know, something like NIST 800 and use that as your control set. However, I think you alluded to some of the changes that they've done is adding some clarity in that, and I think that's maybe because people weren't aware necessarily that you could use other control sets. So that's definitely a good thing. And also, I think in the new standard as well, I think they've alluded to the fact that you can mix and match a little bit more as well.
Yeah.
I think you can use some of the controls out of the Annex A as in the new 2022, and you can also then say, well, actually we like the controls better maybe in NIST 800 or in COBIT or something or other that is more relevant to what we do, and apply those. So I think that's actually quite a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think if you've got a good knowledge of some of the frameworks around and so on, and maybe you're a sort of medium to large organization, then, and also you maybe have drivers to comply with some of these. So you may, if you operate in US markets, then they may require
COBIT.
that you know, it's COBIT or it's NIST and so on. So I think it's certainly going to help in that respect. I think if you're an organization, particularly a small to medium organization that just wants to get certified with 27001, you're probably still going to go down the route that a lot of people go down, which is there's a perfectly good set of controls at the back of 27001. Let's use those because it's going to cover pretty much everything that we need to do, and it simplifies the process of becoming certified as well. So I think it's going to depend. I think it's going to be, as I said earlier, there's definite recognition of the fact that the information security world is becoming a bit more complicated. If it could become more complicated, and there are multiple choices and there are multiple requirements. There's more regulation. You know, even if you look at sort of things like privacy, there's countries are introducing privacy laws all over the place at the moment, and regulation is increasing. So certainly having that flexibility to use different control sets and sort of mix and match a little bit is a good thing.
Okay, let's do our discussion points. I've got one question in the question box. So if anybody else has got any questions, please just drop them into the question box. So the question is, what do we do if we're certified to 27001 and 27701?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's a good question. As I said earlier, you know, the two things are closely related. So, so if you're certified to 27701, it's a set of controls that maps onto the 2013 version of Annex A of the 27001 standard. I think if it was me, we're not certified to 27701, but I think if it was me, Depends partly on I think your attitude to transitioning to the new version 27001. If you're in a hurry to do that, then you're going to have to cope with a situation where you've got potentially one set of Annex A controls to do with your 27001 implementation, and a slightly different set of Annex A controls to do with your 27701 implementation. It's doable. I think you're going to end up having at least one kind of matrix that shows, and all this information is available in things like 27002 and so on. You're going to have to show a mapping between the old controls and the new controls, and therefore how your 27701 controls relate to the way you've implemented 27001. I would say if you're not in a hurry to get to the new version of 27001, I would probably just wait until the new version of 27701 comes out and then do them as a job lot, do them both at the same time, so that then you're migrating from, or transitioning I should say, from the old set of controls to the new set of controls, complete with the revised 27701 controls as well. So that would seem to be a cleaner way of doing it, but it does mean you've got to wait until ISO publishes the new version of 27701. You might be able to get ahead of the game if they do the process I was talking about earlier, and if they do a draft, an early draft, and then a final draft, you can get a good heads up in terms of what's likely to be in there and the structure and so on. So you could probably start to implement a bit earlier than the actual publication date. But it's a difficult one. I think the route they've gone down with some of these standards, where the standards stack on other standards, I think we're starting to see that it's a little bit, it makes things a little bit difficult sometimes, because there's definite dependencies there. And if the core standard changes, so I mean, effectively what you've got is 27002 at the bottom, then you've got 27001 sits on top of 27002, and then really 27701 sits on top of 27001, if I'm not just randomly mentioning numbers. So I think if you've got too many in the stack, it becomes very unwieldy. So I wonder whether ISO is starting to think about whether that's a good approach to take, or whether they ought to maybe make 27701 a standalone privacy standard that you can become certified to without having those kind of dependencies. I don't know.
Okay, well, no further questions then. Just leaves me to thank both Ken and Jerry for their input to this webinar. I hope it's been a lot of information for you. I know there's been lots of numbers being thrown at you, because I'm confused now. But you will be getting a copy of this presentation in the next 1 or 2 days from our salespeople. And if you need any further information, please go to our website and have a look at the information on there. There's loads of stuff on the new standard and the old standard and all the other ISOs out there. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening and have a good week.
Thanks, everybody.